Not Yet Uhuru, the autobiography of Oginga Odinga, with a foreword by Kwame Nkrumah. Acknowledgements. Now that the writing is done, I am faced with a task which I fulfill with pleasure, but find by no means easy. I wish to acknowledge with thanks the help of those without whom I would not have undertaken this book. Many hands helped to make these pages, and their degrees of contribution vary. Acknowledgements themselves appear casual and say little about the individuals whose criticisms, suggestions, research, findings, technical assistance, and ideas, often expressed in casual conversation, rendered me invaluable service. Those I here mention by no means exhaust the list, but as I have said, I do not find it easy to record in full my indebtedness to friends and colleagues. My talks with the late Carrie Francis, my old teacher, recalled for me a wealth of experience that I was able, in retrospect, to distill and evaluate. My elder brother, Abisai, about whom I should say much, Odhiambo Okello, Othigo Otieno, Rading Omolo, provided me with valuable information and advice. I drew from the experience of many elders, among whom Paul Mboya, Simeon Nyande, Anindo Nyakachunga, Timotheo Mondo, Paul Olola, Elijah Masinde, and Canon Jeremiah Awori were of great assistance. I am indebted to Tom Okello Odongo, BFF Olwande Codwall, and Odhiambo Masika, who worked as my private secretaries, and to my good friend and legal advisor, Pranlal Sheth. I would consider my acknowledgement incomplete without special mention of D.O. Makasembo, who played a leading part in the political struggle in central Nyanza and in Kenya as a whole. His untimely death in a motor accident has left a gap which will remain unbridged for long. The principal and secretary of Maseno School kindly allowed me to refer to school records. I must mention with gratitude the work done in typing the manuscript from tapes and in final form by Caroline Okello Odongo and Emma Pinto. I have told frankly the story of my life and political activity, admitting my mistakes and miscalculations, and trying to write about the early days without too much hindsight, though this might be difficult for anyone to shed completely. I have tried to show that there have been consistent threads running through our struggle from the early years until the present, and that my own policies, though they have traveled a long way since I became involved in village affairs in Nyanza, have been consistent too. I am deeply perturbed that in Kenya today, those who sacrificed most in the struggle have lost out to people who played safe in our most difficult days. For the story of the emergency years, I must acknowledge with deep appreciation the information divulged by Bildad Kagia, J.D. Kali, Kamau Gisholi Kithua, and James Buter, which they told for publication for the first time. Acheng Oneko gave me information about the early days of KAU Cow, and Jonathan Okwiri about Piny Owacho. Most important, I am immensely grateful to Ruth First, who has not only edited the manuscript but also given it shape. This is one of the tasks for which the writer alone bears ultimate responsibility, and in this I am no exception. Nairobi, Kisumu, June 1966. Forward. A turning point has now been reached in Africa's history. After years of patient effort to achieve the total political and economic emancipation of the continent by peaceful means, only limited results have been achieved, and it has become essential to adopt a more militant and positive strategy. Recent developments in Africa, for example, the outbreak of military coups and the continuance of Ian Smith's illegal government, have demonstrated the ruthless and insidious nature of Africa's enemies. The imperialists and neo-colonialists are acting in strength and in unity. Africans must do the same. To know the enemy is to be equipped to defeat him. Ordinary men and women throughout Africa, even those living in the most remote villages, are now talking the language of the African Revolution. They speak of unity and are prepared for the next, more realistic phase of the struggle. In fact, a situation has arisen in which the people of Africa are ahead of their governments in that they have accepted the idea of unity, while their leaders, in many cases, continue to hold back or to proceed too slowly. But pressure from below will inevitably force the pace onward, and nothing can halt the process towards union government. It is clearer than ever that the political union of Africa, which has been one of my main preoccupations since the attainment of independence by Ghana, is the key to Africa's economic and political stability, peace, and progress. A union government of Africa backed by organized military power with sound continental economic planning is bound to compel nations outside Africa to respect our collective interests. States with imperialist tendencies, however powerful, will tremble before taking unilateral decisions to interfere in our affairs. Economically, no state in Africa, however less gifted by nature, need be afraid of its development and progress within the Union. For economic development on a continental scale implies harnessing and harmonizing Africa's vast physical and mineral resources for the benefit of the whole mass of people of the continent. In any event, with the achievement of a union government, Africa could have an effective say in external economic relations and activities, including trade and international flow of funds. The story that my friend and fellow freedom fighter Jaramogi Oginga Odinga of Kenya has told in this book is reminiscent of many a biography in Africa. For the African nationalist who nourishes genuine feelings for his people and for Africa is bound to be the victim of oppression and persecution during colonial rule. In every program arranged by the colonialists of Africa for Africans, it is often easy to see the shameful designs intended to hoodwink the unwary. Whether it is in school or college or in any type of institution, so long as it is run by the colonialists for colonial people, this is generally the case. Kenya under colonial rule, unlike the average colony in West Africa, was plagued with settler problems. Consequently, the liberation struggle in Kenya was bound to be one of the most dramatic in the history of the continent. It is therefore no surprise that the political life of a person like Jaramogi Oginga Odinga should have been as challenging as it is. It is one of the merits of this autobiography that it tells the story of events which are characteristic of the life of freedom fighters and under colonial rule. The Mau Mau uprising in Kenya brought even closer Ghana's attention to the struggle of our brothers in Kenya. I had declared at Ghana's independence that our freedom would be meaningless unless the liberation of the whole continent was linked with it. We naturally felt gravely concerned and in fact became closely associated with the liberation struggle in other parts of Africa. It was, therefore, a matter of sincere gratification to us that within a few years following our own independence, many other erstwhile colonial territories should join the family of free and sovereign African states. It was in order to eradicate totally and completely foreign rule and domination from Africa and to fortify the continent against the turbulent world of power politics that we bent our concerted efforts towards unity. It is in this sense that I consider the establishment of the OAU as an important step forward from which we had quickly to move on to the formation of a union government of Africa. It is my view that, in the interest of African unity, there should be no political or economic regrouping of blocs in Africa in alliance with any ex-colonial power or any foreign power for that matter, unless economic groupings in Africa are established only under the aegis and umbrella of an all-African union government. They will be detrimental to our Pan-African growth. Although political independence is a noble achievement in the struggle against colonialism, neocolonialism, and imperialism, its effectiveness is superficial unless economic and cultural independence is also achieved. The road to the attainment of economic and cultural independence is beset with neo-colonialism, which is becoming even more menacing to newly independent states than orthodox colonialism. I find it gratifying indeed that Oginga Odinga has given me this opportunity to write a foreword for his autobiography. It is my hope and belief that those who read this book will see even more clearly the need for the peoples of Africa to come together in a closely knit political union in pursuit of their common aspirations and common objectives. Kwame Nkrumah, Conakry, 14th June 1966. In the course of our struggle against foreign rule and for independence, the decisive contribution was made by the people of Kenya, the unnamed thousands and tens of thousands who acted at crucial times in the national struggle. When the political temperature was highest, the KANU youth and women wings were the greatest single force of our struggle and its nerve center. Youth wingers at the coast were led by Msanifu Kombo and Okondo Onyango in central Nyanza by Ochola Achola, Oro No, Were Olonde, and Otuge Omwoso. At Kiambu by Wairoho, at Naivasha by Kigathi, and by Sami Maina, Akoko Mboya, and Oduya Oprong in Nairobi. The women's wing created the political consciousness which sent the women to the polls, and it is they who voted to sweep our first independence government into power. In Nairobi, Margaret Kenyatta and Anna Wanjiko were among the Mama Uhurus who did splendid work. Central Nyanza women were championed by Magdalena Aboge and Nyangisa Ojino, Owino Ongongo, and Mama Uhuru Alima of Mumias, Kakamega district. The youth and women wingers galvanized the people on whose support we rode to victory. They were never afraid of bullets, tear gas, or jail. I dedicate this book, the story of my life and political struggle, to the youth of Kenya, my country, as the spirit of the youth carried us through our hardest days in the fight for independence. So on the youth depends the shape of the new Kenya. Chapter 1. At the feet of the village elders. Among the Luo of central Nyanza, the forecasters had said of the white people, if you touch them, the skin will remain in your hand because they are very soft. But they will come with thunderstorms and they will burn the people. Omuodo Alogo was the chief elder of my village, and he told me he had seen these people, some of whom were as white as snow, some as red as fire, and that they had an instrument that harbored the thunder and that hit from afar. When these people first came, the story goes, the elders had warned that we should never, never try to fight them because their weapons were better than ours. They would be intent on devouring our land and our wealth, but we should be wary of them. If they asked for cooking flour, we should give it. We should give whatever they requested, even animals. But we should study their lives and their minds to know exactly what they wanted. We should never fight them, but we knew that when we had studied them, our children would probably be able to get rid of them. Now that we saw many whites, not that we saw many whites, the first white man I saw was the missionary Archdeacon Owen. This was the time of a plague outbreak. The children of our village were taken to be inoculated. We were very frightened, for we thought we might die. We allowed the Archdeacon only to touch us, and then ran home as fast as we could. We were lucky we did not catch the plague, for that year it claimed many of our relatives and neighbors. The villagers were told that to stop the plague we should trap the rats, cut off the tails, and send them to the chief's baraza. From there I learnt later the rats' tails were bundled in tens and sent to Kisumu headquarters. On the walls of the commissioners' offices hung charts of the monthly rat returns. It was in these years that the government started to collect taxes from our people. Taxes and the orders to produce rats' tails have always been associated together as the arm of government reaching out to our villages. When the time came to take a register of taxpayers, government clerks were sent to the villages. Our mothers had news of the approach of these awesome strangers, and they hid the children in the bush and brought us food there. We children were curious and we crept out to gaze secretly at the encroachers. We watched them take up a papyrus reed from the roof of each hut and cut it neatly in two. When the reeds were tied in neat bundles, they represented the registration of that boma. One bundle was given to the elder for him to take to the chief's baraza when he paid in the taxes. The other set of bundles was taken away by the clerks as a tally of the taxpayers of the area, a sort of carbon copy of the registration. The clerks who came with the whites for the tax registration were not people of our tribe. They spoke Swahili and we called them Okoche. We connected whites and government with five main things. There were the inoculations against the plague from which the children ran in fear. There were the tax collections. There was the order to the villagers to work on the roads. There were clothes, kanzu, the long robes copied from our Arab garb at the coast, given free to the chiefs and elders to wear to encourage others in the tribe to clothe themselves in modern dress. There were the schools which came later, and to which, in the beginning, only orphans, foster children, poor nieces and nephews, and never the favorite sons were sent, for the villagers distrusted the pressure on them to send their children out of the home and away from herding the animals, and the more alert objected to the way the Christian missions taught, this custom yours is bad, and this ours is good, for they could see that the children at the missions would grow up to despise Luo ways. One year there were instructions that we should go to the chief's camp to be vaccinated against smallpox. The district commissioner was to be there that day, and I was curious to see him, for though I had seen my first white in the person of Archdeacon Owen, it had been a fleeting encounter. A friend and I went towards the chief's camp, hoping for a close-up view of the white commissioner. But as we approached, a headman caught us and took us by force to the vaccination center. The first time I saw a bicycle was the day we children were given baskets of simsim and maize to take to the Kadimo Indian shopping center, about 12 miles from our home. Chief Olulo Nyadenda, in a white kanzu, rode by on a bicycle, passing us so quickly that I was reminded of a snake. He was followed by the district commissioner, flashing past, and they went on to the shops ahead of us. There I had my first glimpse of an Indian. It was astonishing to hear an Indian speaking in Dholuo. His body looked as soft as a baby's when it is newly born. When the Indian came to carry my basket, I thought he would never manage to lift it. His body looked so soft. The simsim I carried to the shop fetched about 25 cents, and with this money I bought a length of material to be used as a loincloth. When I returned home, I did not, of course, wear it to milk the cows. I took it off and hung it on a wooden peg outside the granary. While I was milking, an animal came along and ate my loincloth. I had my first piece of clothing for less than a day. My attempt to calculate my age is associated with clothing. My parents were not educated and they did not register the date of my birth, so I have had to work backwards to estimate it. I remember an old man, Elijah Bonyo, had a khaki jumper with a red buttoned flap at the back. Years later, when I met Bonyo, he told me he had this jersey in 1918. At the time, I remember him in the jersey with a flap. I had begun to look after our animals, which would have made me a small boy of 6 or 7 years. I can work out my age by association with other events, of course. Immediately after the 1914 to 1918 war, there was a severe famine. My mother went away to search for food, and I was left to look after my younger sister and a small brother. I fetched vegetables from the bush and cooked them until my mother returned. I must have been at least 6 years old to have been able to take charge until our mother returned, and as the famine was between 1918 and 1919, I think I was born between 1911 and 1912. My mother told me I was born during the short rains, which begin normally between September and December, so I placed my birth at October 1911. My home village, Nyamera Kango, is in Sakwa location, Central Nyanza district, near Lake Nyanza, formerly Lake Victoria. We in Kenya dropped that name in 1964, which is the water link between Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika. Nyanza province in the west of Kenya lies across the equator. To our west are the lake and Uganda, to the east the Rift Valley province with its thick white settlement, and to the south Masai land and Tanzania. The former Nyanza, which included Western Province and Kericho, has always been known as Kenya's granary and labor pool. The Luo are more agricultural than other Nilotic people, but we keep many cattle and fishing is important along the shores of the lake. 5 peoples live in Nyanza. Our neighbors are the Baluya, Kisi, Kuria, and the Kipsigis, who live along the high ridges. My great-grandfather was Rapondi, son of Wenwa. He fathered 4 sons, among them my grandfather Raila. According to our clan history, Raila was not a well-to-do man, nor in fact was my father, nor others further back in our lineage. My father passed down to me the story that Raila was too poor to afford cattle for a wife. He worked on his plot of land to grow just enough food to feed himself. He was lucky to meet a widow who had left her children in her husband's home and come to relatives in Sakwa. My grandfather decided to marry her because for such a woman the dowry was low. So Raila married Omindo, daughter of Otengo of Konya Kajulu, and together they worked in the fields to raise animals for her dowry. Of this marriage there were 6 sons and 2 daughters. Raila combined providence with frugality. He had a premonition that a great famine was approaching, so he and Omindo dug a deep hole in the center of their hut, where they buried a pot and stored a portion of the grain from every harvest. The famine did come, and the neighbors were astonished that this poor man could feed his family. We children had this story recounted to us for the moral that without the land none of us could survive, and we should not fail each morning to go to work on our plots. Raila's sons were Oburu, Ngire, Omodo, Otengo, Amolo, and Ajuma. It was the last born, Ajuma, who married my mother, but Ajuma died shortly after the birth of their second child. My grandfather had taken a second wife after Omindo, and by this marriage had produced 3 sons, Ocheng, Odinga, and Raila, named after myself. When Ajuma died, his half-brother Odinga took my mother into his household, according to the tradition that the widow is cared for by her brother-in-law. Odinga had 2 previous wives, so my mother became his third. I was born of that union. In all, we were 3 brothers and 2 sisters in our mother's house. Of my uncles, Oburu was the administrator, a liberal and popular man. Gire was a district disciplinarian who dealt ruthlessly with mischievous gossiping women. Omodo was a man of justice, chosen by his brothers as a leader to judge village cases and solidify the people of the village. It was Omodo, above all, who was the unifying force among his brothers and their respected chairman. I was Omodo's favorite. I had always to be at his feet. He called me to bring his fire for smoking, to fetch his wood, and we ate together in his small office house. Omodo was the leader not only of our family, but of all the families in our neighborhood. He was stern and ruthless when dealing with transgressors, and I pitied those who fell foul of his judgment. But though he was strict and quick to act against the lazy, he showed no partiality towards his sons or those of his brothers, but laid down the law fairly against the relatives and outsiders alike. In among the thick hillside vegetation of the Sakwa area lie fields of maize and millet, and clusters of homesteads of thatched huts. Our village, like all Luo villages, was neatly fenced about by euphorbia trees or ojuok, as we call them. Inside the circular village were 20 neatly built huts, forming a concentric circle within the fence. In the center were 4 small huts, which we regarded as the headquarters of the elders of the village. The one in the center was the duol, or office of the Jaduong Dala, or chief elder. He was Omuodo Alogo. Next to this hut was the office of Odinga, my father, then that of Oteke, the uncle of Omodo Alogo. and the fourth belonged to a friend who had married one of our sisters and come to live in our village. Each hut in the village represented one woman. Elder Omodo Alogo had 6 women, Odinga had 5, Oteke had 3, and so on. In all, there were 36 children in the village. Omodo Alogo was regarded as owner of the village, leader and lawmaker, and the giver of orders. He had to consult with the other elders, and they formed themselves into a kind of village cabinet to regulate village life and maintain discipline. Head of our family, head of the village, and accepted as leader of the surrounding villages was Omodo Alogo, and by virtue of his leadership, our home became the headquarters of our area. Many people called on us each day. They came to discuss a problem with Omodo Alogo or to attend a meeting he called. Though Omodo's father and grandfather had been poor people, he was well to do by African standards. He was also generous and refused no one in need of a dowry who had no animals of his own. He gave frequent beer parties, and from the songs about him, I knew he was praised for his charity, wisdom, and farsightedness. I was with Omodo during the 1918 to 19 famine called the Kanga, and I have never forgotten his actions. He would fetch me late every night and take me from granary to granary to examine the food stocks. When we found a granary with little left in it, he would direct me to a granary which had plenty, and we would replenish the almost exhausted store. When asked why he did this, he said we should be kind to those who had nothing. Women with many children had greater need, and to prevent argument over food shares, he thought it best to arrange a redistribution himself by night. When it came to disciplinary action, Omodo was cruel and ruthless, but when he was ill, people came long distances to see him and wish for his speedy recovery. He died one evening in 1934, and many people came to mourn, taking off all their clothes and daubing themselves with ash, the dress of mourning, in ceremonial tribute and respect for Omodo. The weeping and wailing went on all night, and I recalled the grim scene for many years. Life in our village followed an even routine. The elders woke first each morning, got their pangas ready, and went to prepare their plots for the work that would follow that day. The children were awakened by them as they were leaving for the land, and our first duty was to milk the cows. We delivered the milk to the huts where the women, with the young girls at their side, were waiting to churn the butter. When we boys had done the milking, we tied the animals near the granaries and ran to our houses to drink milk with corn, a millet flour bread that is red in color, which had been prepared the day before. Then we went to the land to dig the ground cleared by our fathers. Sometimes we worked in groups, at other times we worked our fathers' individual holdings. While we dug, the very young children were in charge of grazing the goats and the sheep. At about 10 o'clock, our fathers left the land and returned to the village. An hour or so later, we boys had to return home to release the cattle from their stakes and take them into the grazing field. This was the time we enjoyed, for we arranged between ourselves for some of us to tend the animals while the rest took part in games. We wrestled and raced one another. If there was a pond nearby, we swam. The elders were always at a distance supervising us, watching to see if our animals strayed into our garden, and when we neglected our duties, they appeared among us to chastise us. By midday, the women had returned to the village to prepare our food and cultivate the vegetable plots, assisted by the girls. In the afternoon, the elders went back to the lands to clear the areas we would have to dig the following day, and some of the boys were taken with them to learn how best to clear the bush. In the evening, we brought the cows home and milked them, leaving the milk in the churns for the next morning's butter. Then we had to clean and sweep the village while our fathers sat in the offices and watched us at work. It was in the evenings that our fathers would meet the elders from nearby villages. The women would bring beer and the men would drink it as they talked, exchanging the news whether anyone had gone on safari, and they would discuss the work they were planning for the village for subsequent days. The women were ready with the food at about 7 o'clock, and the elders sat in their respective offices to be served with it. The children from each hut had to carry the food to the elder, and this was the time that the sons joined their fathers to enjoy the food prepared in the various huts. Some women had cooked vegetables, others fish, meat, or chicken, and all taken together there was a variety of dishes. But the elders were strict about our eating, encouraging us to eat more corn or cassava rather than meat and reprimanding the boys who ate greedily. When the evening meal was over, we sat at the feet of the elders, for now they would gather in the office of the village of the chief village elder and discuss the problems of the village. We boys listened attentively. The elders might instruct us about our duties or they might tell stories. The stories of the elders were one of our two sources of education in the village. The other source was the harpists who played an important role in the community. The harpists learnt at the feet of the elders and expressed the people's philosophy in musical and poetic language. The Luo people lived around the lake and their harpists drew imagery and source of inspiration from the water. Through their songs, the harpists chanted words of inspiration to the warriors, praised famous wrestlers, admired beautiful girls, recognized keen farmers whose granaries were always full. Their humor was entertaining. They acknowledged men who were experts at courting and through whom others managed to secure wives. They praised men and women who had achieved distinction in the community. They condemned thieves, lazy people, cowards, and people with bad habits. In the community, the harpists were a recognized institution, awarding approval to individual and communal achievements, and admonishing and reprimanding those who did not come up to standard. The greatest among the modern harpists, Otuoma, warned that we fight for water and land, and that our aim is to attack the enemy's heart and defend our eyes. But however victorious we may be, there is always an end, and our brave ones pass away, leaving behind only their names for us to remember. He sang that water was the source of inspiration, wisdom, and life, and he used the analogy of water as the source of transmitting and understanding of current affairs. A rough translation of a part of one of his songs runs as follows: "The sea, how great are you, that your message suffers no blow for the tide. So faithful a servant conveys your power and presence. True, is it not true that the tide, so efficient and sure, at your shore does surrender the mighty message to the mountain? Between the mountain peaks does the message signal the affairs current to the wilderness so quiet and steady and the wind takes over the performance. From the wise, calm and great doctor, the wilderness, in other words, they say, summons the wind to move with a message for our ears to receive." At about 9 o'clock, after hearing the elders, we went to bed, leaving the elders talking among themselves. Young boys and girls slept together in their grandmothers' houses, and we were told stories of the past. The older boys went to sleep in the Simba, a dormitory built near the gates by the grown-up boys who were yet unmarried. Boys grown too big to live in the houses of the old women stayed in the dormitory house and there became acquainted with girls from other villages and had dances at night. We were never allowed to drink anything alcoholic, only milk or thin porridge, and the elders were strict about this. Generally, young people who had to be disciplined for failing to fetch firewood or failing to milk the animals or work in the gardens were singled out by the elders, but they were not reprimanded directly. The elders would report the child to his mother, and she would have to call him to order. If the mother resisted the disciplining of her child, she would be driven out of the village and kept out for some time, even for months. I can remember this happening in our family. I had neglected our animals one day, but notwithstanding that my mother gave me food that evening. My mother was considered far too protective towards a boy who had done no work, and we had both to spend 3 days out of the village. My brothers were left alone and our gardens untended. This was an admonition that could not be taken lightly. In our custom, this is not really a harshness directed against the women, but an insistence that women are the custodians of the children and their educators. If the children misbehaved, it was their mother who had to be shown the error of her ways. Women took second place in the conduct of many affairs, but they also had an important role to play. They were the custodians not only of the children, but also of the granary, and theirs was the responsibility to conserve food for times of drought and famine. The clans were named after women in recognition that they are the mothers of the children, and thus the founders of the clans. No marriage could be solemnized without the presence of the mother as well as the father, and even in the case of divorced and separated couples, both parents came together once more for the marriage ceremony of their children. Older women who became wealthy as a result of their diligence were consulted on many questions, and in some instances, there were women chairmen of elders' councils. We were taught that a good statesman would not give precipitate judgment, but would defer his decision. When an elder said, I must consult the pillow before I make a judgment, it was understood that he would discuss it with the women. Each clan, there were about 2 dozen in all Luoland, was a gathering of sub-clans, and it had its own chief, Ruoth. The Ruoth worked closely with the Ajwoke and Jobilo, the prophet diviner, the warrior leader, and the council of elders. Each clan was entirely self-dependent. It had its own territory and its own leadership, and in the old days had acted independently in war. Outstanding Jobilo or warrior leaders were recognized beyond their own clans and tribe, but there was no permanent paramount leadership of the Luo. A chief did not issue orders. He sounded out the elders, met them in consultation, and when he said, This is my decision, he was announcing not his personal verdict, but an agreed point of view. His function was not to lay down the law, but to consult and arbitrate to learn the consensus of opinion, and to keep the unity of his people. Elders were men of substance and integrity, and recognized as outstanding individuals. Even when they came from leading lineages, they did not inherit leadership but had to demonstrate it. Diligence yielded prosperity and brought respect, but riches alone did not count for leadership, and a rich man who was offensive was not respected. In the village, the authority of the elders was much respected. Indeed, it was never challenged. The elder gave the signal that the season for clearing the fields, planting, weeding, or harvesting had begun. The elder was the first man in the village to build a granary, and the first wife of the head of the village was the woman who gave the signal to bring in and store the harvest. No villager would have dreamt of opening a season without the initiation of the work by the elder. No one was permitted even to taste the maize from the land or bring it for cooking before the chief elder's first wife had cooked her new season's maize and eaten it in her house. It was a bad omen and a breach of village discipline not to wait for the chief elder to act first. And the land elders, the Jodongweng, regulated all activities connected with our land. The Luo regarded the land as their mother, and the tribe as a whole was the proprietor of all the land in its area. Within the tribe, clan or subclan, the individual laid claim to a shamba or several, depending on his diligence, but he used the land for the benefit of his family only as long as he lived in the community. As soon as he left to live elsewhere, the land reverted to the community and was allocated to the nearest neighbor or given to a newcomer joining the community. A piece of land left uncultivated for a season could be used for grazing by anyone in the clan without his having to ask permission or pay a fee. Even animals were strictly speaking not private but community property, and a man who was unable to raise animals for his dowry would ask for help from a relation or a neighbor who was under an obligation to help him acquire a wife for marriage was considered a community obligation, and children the gain of the community as a whole. Common ownership of the land was accompanied by a system of communal cultivation. You had your own plot, but you helped others dig, plant, and weed theirs, and your turn to be helped came around in strict rota. When the village worked your land, you supplied food and water. When you helped others, they fed you. This is where the role of the village elders in regulating the work of the seasons was so important. The system was known as saga farming. Communities of anything from 2 to 500 people, headed by the elders, decided which shambas would be farmed each season, and then plot by plot, from those alongside the river to those extending to the hilltops. All would work side by side. This concerted farming could work only if it was highly disciplined, which it was. It was understood that all should take part in their work. The midday meal was carried to the fields, so any malingerer who was not at work on the shambas would not eat that day. Land disputes that arose were always settled by the Jodongweng, who manipulated our flexible system of land tenure and made adjustments for individuals within the community with the consent of the community. There were many who lived and worked on the land of friends, neighbors, and relatives. If there was a shortage of land in any one area, people could move to live among another clan on its stretch of land. Under the system of low land tenure and saga farming, individual land ownership was not entrenched, and cooperation was a spirit in which the people were deeply steeped. It might be said that this traditional Luo farming was halfway to socialism. Shambas were allocated so that there should be equal sharing of the land near and far from the river, equal allocation of plots suitable for different crops like cotton and maize, and a sharing of plots that could be worked in the different seasons. The very dispersal of plots worked by one family was deliberate and a form of equality. This was ignored by government land consolidation teams when they started working in the 50s. The opposition to the teams and to government agriculture policy in general lay in the fact that plans for reforming our agriculture flew in the face of our most deep rooted practices. Land consolidation meant the gathering of all a man's land fragments into a single holding and their registration in individual title deeds. The cardinal principle of low land ownership is that land was transferable for use in the community. Whereas under the traditional system of farming, all, even newcomers to an area, were accommodated and allocated land to farm, people feared that when the land was consolidated and they could produce no direct claim to a shamba, they would have nowhere to live. The way that improved farming methods and even land consolidation for more economic use of labor on the land could work would have been by consolidating and registering the land not of individuals but of the clan or subclan as a whole. But the government did not try to understand the Luo method of land allocation or the rhythm of our saga farming, and the people were resentful and suspicious of anything imposed by government. My first experience of the government of Kenya was in our home when my cousin, Migaya Oburu, the government appointed headman, came from attending the chief's baraza to tell people the government's orders and requirements for our locality. Umodo Alogo had himself been asked to act as government headman, but he had refused, saying that he had no wish to be sent about by the whites as a little child. He deputed his nephew Migaya instead. The district commissioner was remote from the people. He lived in Kisumu, and we heard about him as the head of all the chiefs, but the people never or rarely saw him. The provincial commissioner seemed like a king, so far away and exalted that we doubted his existence. As we heard there was a king and a governor, so we heard there was a provincial commissioner. We knew little about him. The government was feared rather than respected. Agricultural instructors came to inspect our fields for cotton, but they never taught us anything. They only asked questions, and if we did not answer quickly or did not give them the answers they wanted, they beat us with a hippo whip. Veterinary inspectors came too, but they wanted to be respected as chiefs, and they accepted as good and loyal only those villagers who gave them beer parties and presents. As a boy, I watched from a distance the goings on at the barazas. The chief was harsh in both his language and his treatment of the people, and did not hesitate to slap an elder if the man did not stand quickly or sit where he was told. Any instructions given to the people were accompanied by beatings. The askari kanga was cruel and weighed heavily into the people singled out by the chief. When the district commissioner was due at a baraza, the atmosphere was tense and the people were frightened. As the commissioner approached, all had to stand, and if you were slow to rise to your feet, the askaris might seize a chair and hit out with it. Sometimes people were beaten to a point of helplessness and near death. The government, I decided, had come not to help us, but to instill fear into us, and, out of fear, obedience. The commissioner was remote, yet his power was felt. It was the chiefs and the headmen responsible to the commissioner who moved constantly among the people. The Milango had the duty of collecting taxes and carrying orders from government to the people. The chief's main duty was to report to the baraza and to ensure his villagers' attendance there. My memory is still clear of one baraza which was bigger than all the others, flocked to from far and wide. It was held about 25 miles from my home at a place called Lunda in Game location. It was said that the great roars of the people, "This land is ours," had made the sheep and the goats break loose from their tethering posts and run into the bush. Politics had begun to rise in the country in about 1920.